I'm going to talk about planting in all the different forms, from ball and burlap, B&B it's called, to bare root. So this is ball and burlap. These are actually these two trees that are out on the side of the building. And these trees were developed by Nina Bassick in a program that she's doing down at Cornell, trying to develop a urban forest tree that will withstand drought, salt, vandalism, the whole 9 yards. So we're going to take a GPS coordinate of these trees, and she's going to monitor them, or her group, for the next 10 years to see how they do and how they survive in the. But most trees you'll see of 2-inch caliper or bigger will come in this form, which is called balled burlap.
Up to 2 inches, you said? They're over 2 inches.
Over 2 inches and bigger, you can get an 1.5 inch caliper tree in a container. For instance, this is a containerized, this is called pot and pot system nursery. So what they do is they grow a 25-gallon pot in a 25-gallon pot buried in the ground. And then they run drip irrigation to each container. And then when the trees are ready to harvest, you just pull that container right out of the ground. I was at a seminar about 2-3 years ago, and the guy had a great point that there should be an expiration date on these containers. Because if you leave them in the pots too long, you'll get girdling roots, and they'll become root bound in the containers. So you really have to, make sure you get them out of that, upsize them, or get them in the ground before they get too big or too root bound. And then the other one is bare root. And for, obviously that tree weighs nothing compared to containerized and ball and burlap. So we'll just go over all the benefits of all three. So that is a very big ball and burlap tree. This is a memorial tree that we planted for Brian Skinner. Brian was a lifelong arborist and did a lot for the forestry community in central New York, and planted that on the grounds of the State Fair in Syracuse. And this soil actually was the old track, the old horse track that was on the fairgrounds. But you can see I think that's a 4.5 inch caliper tree. And it took something to get that in the ground that day. We had ropes and because it fell over, and we had 12 guys trying to straighten it out. But
what do you think that root ball weighs?
A lot. That had to be over a couple thousand pounds easily. Yeah.
Some of the bigger trees that Chico was selling of those crosses were over 1,000-pound root balls. That really scared me.
Yeah.
For that reason.
Yeah, and that was tricky getting that in the hole, because it weighs so much, and then that bobcat can only go back so far, and then the hole goes at an angle. So it was tricky, but we got it in the ground, and it went pretty well. But so they say you throw the soil back in that came out of the hole, because that tree needs to get acclimated to that soil and its environment. So if we just took all that soil away and brought in some real nice, lovely soil, those tree roots are going to grow into that real nice, lovely soil, hit that garbage, and go, whoa, wait a minute, I don't want to go there. I'm going to stay in this soil. And what could happen is you could also have girdling roots develop that way, because it's the easiest path of least resistance to stay in that modified soil. So always throw the soil back in. You could add some amendments and maybe peat moss or some roots, which is roots, which is a fertilizer that helps the root process go along, develop better roots. But yeah, throw back in what you take out. So the one downside to B&B trees is when they dig these trees in the nursery, they're leaving 2/3 of that root system behind. So, I was just at a nursery yesterday, and I took this picture. This is a good example. So if they were to dig that bald burlap, all those fine root system, all these fine roots here will be gone and cut. So that tree is gonna take 1.5 to 2 years to generate those fine roots, which are your feeder roots. The big roots are storage. The little tiny roots take in the water, the nutrients, and that's what really sustains the tree. So one downside is that it's gonna take 1 year or 2 for that tree to say, okay, I'm ready to start growing now. And they're heavy, so you have to make sure you have a couple of young kids to move them, or a strong back or some equipment. That's, if there is a downside, that's it. This is another tree, actually Jeff and I, Terry and Steve Blair from Bartlett, planted in the park for Brian, another memorial tree. This is a white pine. So and I came across, the internet, you find everything. And there was the homeowner handyman website. And I couldn't download the picture because it was too blurry, but they said, never take the wire basket off. Well, that's the exact opposite. You have to take the wire basket off. We'll take off probably up to 75% of the basket and leave maybe just the bottom part on, because because once you get that top part of the basket off, and if that root system isn't real tight, the ball's gonna fall apart, and you're gonna rip and tear roots. So we'll take 2/3 to 75% of that basket off, because if you don't take the basket off, this was a real big fir tree that I took down last summer. And you see how tight that root system is? Well, I'm holding that tree by the basket. They left the basket on. So what happened is, this root system can't spread out because it's being restricted by the wire basket. So, this is a great example of, and actually, let's see if I can.
They made out of like wire, metal wire?
Yeah, it's a wire basket. Yeah, like the picture I showed a couple slides before, that wire basket, they left it on. So that, I'm hooked right onto the basket. I pulled that tree, and it came right out of the ground. And it was a pretty good size fir tree. So, and I mean, not everybody takes the basket off, because they don't know. So fortunately, everyone in this room today, we're here being educated, and we can start doing some better planting methods. So this was Brian's tree that we planted. The one thing with ball and burlap, when they do dig that tree with the tree spade, and they pull that spade up, dirt is going to fall on top of the ball. So you can see the dirt was up to here. You want to clean that ball out till you get to the root flare. Because if you don't, if you plant it to here at ground level, you're too deep. The tree's too deep. If you plant the tree too deep, what's going to happen is, plants are like humans. They need oxygen. The deeper you plant it, the less oxygen that root system is going to be able to get. So you have to make sure that when that's in the ground, that your root flare is at ground level. And you can do that by pulling the burlap back, scraping that off. And so this has no basket, no burlap.
I had a guy yesterday say, what's a root flare?
What's a root flare? Let's see if they have a picture of a root flare. So the root flare is, so trees, when they, at the bottom, if a tree looks like a telephone pole, it's planted too deep. So you want to see that flare at the bottom. So that's what we call the root flare.
Where the weed eater goes.
What's that?
Where the weed eater usually is.
Yeah, where the weed eater hits, a good point. So this is Brian's tree here, and this is in Proctor Park. This is an area of Memorial Garden. Pretty good soil. So that tree is doing pretty well. Containerized, pros and cons. So we'll talk about the pros first. That's a 25 gallon weeping cherry, and that's a good caliper. That's probably 1.75 inches. Easy to handle. So homeowner, they can, throw that in their wagon or, in their trunk and have it sticking out. Make sure you cover with burlap from the wind. But a homeowner can plant that pretty easily. And the benefit of containerized is you're getting all the roots that you're paying for. So 2/3 of these roots aren't being left behind at the nursery. They're all in that container. So that's also the upside of containerized. So here's what I was saying, if it stays in the pot too long, you'll get some girdling roots growing in that container. Here's a prime example here. So what you want to do is you want to take a knife, or I use a tree spade. Tree spade is a short-handled blade shovel, a flat blade shovel. Take that and you're going to cut down the side and then cut on the bottom. So that's going to break that root system, so now those roots are going to grow out that way instead of continuing to grow in a girdling fashion. You want to plant that hole 3 to 4 times wider than the container and then slope the sides. Again, you're putting the same dirt back in that came out. And then, some people will leave these in too long, and that will actually choke the cambium. Especially on maples, the cambium is really thin. So right below the cambium, we all remember from biology, is the xylem and phloem, the life support of the tree. If you cut that off, then that's where you're going to see the tree fail. Norway maples are notorious for girdling roots. So a girdling root will grow, then hook around the back side of the tree and push against that trunk, and that's where that tree will fail. So if you look at a Norway and it's not looking too good, I guarantee you there's a girdling root. And you usually can tell because one side of the tree looks like it goes straight in the ground, the other side you'll see the root flare. It's just another example of some containerized plant material. So bare root is probably the most economical way to go. You can get a bare root tree for, I don't know, Terry, what do we pay for them? Anywhere from 50 to 75 bucks.
1.5 inch, probably 83, 1.75 inches, 95.
Yeah,
And if
so
you dip it, you pay $5 more.
Yeah, so you're gonna pay less, about half, and get a good sized tree, and you're getting a good root system. So these fine roots here, that's what you want. Those are the feeder roots of the tree. The upside of bare root, they're easy to handle, very light, and we have them planted in the spring. Ideally, you want to plant them in the fall. If you do spring planting, you're gonna have to water them all summer long. If you plant in the fall, that Ron Peel oven, set it and forget it. That's what fall planting. Just put them in the ground. They'll do fine. Just make sure they're adequately watered. I don't know if anybody noticed all the burn on the evergreens this year. If you're driving around, a lot of evergreens are burnt from the winter. Well, we had a drought in October, November, and then snow came. Then the snow left and the ground froze. So all the evergreens went into winter dry. And then you have those cold winds, so they desiccated. And you'll look where the prevailing winds are, that's where they all burn. So if you do fall planting, even though you may get a rain like this, that's not enough. You have to really soak that tree down. The nursery I was at yesterday, they were potting up some bare root stuff, and they'll soak the bare root stuff for a day in water before they pot it up. So that tree is taking up all that moisture before they pot it to give it a good start. And this was the nursery I was at yesterday. That's what's left of his bare root stock that they're going to be potting up.
Excuse me, when they get those bare root ones out of the ground, is that the technique you said where you use 2/3 of the roots?
No, they have a machine that actually has a hook.
Yeah.
And it'll go through the row and cut the row and vibrate.
Okay.
And they're sandy soil. Most of these nurseries are like Rochester area, or It's very difficult, obviously, to heavy clay soil. But most of them are sandy loam soil where you can shake the roots off them. And they use like a U blade that goes under the ground and comes under them. Yeah. So planting a bare root tree. So this is our little bag of M-Roots fertilizer. Half a cube of peat moss. You can tell this is a heavy clay soil. So we just want to add a little organic matter to that soil to help that tree along. And obviously your bare root tree, a couple stakes, post pounder, and some wire to wire that up. And then what I like to do, it's either I'm working alone or with my little backhoe there. So I like to stake the tree first and get it square in the hole before I backfill it. And that way I can see where my root flare is, get that ground level, and then backfill it in. That was an Arbor Day planting, I think 3 years ago in the park. So that's the three types of forms that trees come in and the best way to plant them. The next thing is mulch. I mean, there is so much, I call it mulch murder going around. You know, a lot of these landscapers, their big money is to mulch. So every year, they're selling your mulch and they're piling it on and piling it on. And we call them mulch volcanoes, where they just, you know, pile it right up and they're choking the tree out. This is a tree, actually, I ended up digging this one out, but I'm just showing this slide just to show, you know, the mulch was this high up, plus it's planted too deep, so the root flare is probably that far down in the ground. That tree, the homeowner said, this tree's been in the ground 10 years and it's hardly grown. Well, it's barely surviving, you know, it's really because you're suffocating those roots and they're not able to get that oxygen, you know, they're just gonna barely survive. When I dug that out, the roots were growing in the mulch. So again, that was a heavy clay soil. The roots couldn't penetrate the heavy clay. They're like, oh, but we can go up here and get this mulch bed. And then I could have probably just tipped that tree over and pulled it out of the ground. When I took it out, it was just one flat root system that was growing in the mulch bed.
I get thinking about this, you know, that's one of our biggest problems with trying to talk about planting trees right, is most people, a lot of people plant them wrong.
Oh,
And they are convinced they're doing it right because the tree is alive. And so to give them to come to these workshops is hard because their trees live. What's the problem? The problem is they don't grow.
Right.
Or you get a girdling root or any of these.
Yeah, they're
You know,
surviving, but
trees
they're
are
not
tough.
thriving.
They can survive.
Yep, exactly. And I mean, there's a Dunkin' Donuts near where I live in Clinton, and they planted a couple Japanese lilacs. And that Dunkin' Donuts probably been there, I don't know, 12, maybe 15 years. And those lilacs they're just sustaining, and they've never grown. And they've got two huge mulch volcanoes on them. So they'll survive, but they won't thrive. And here we're just putting, you know, if you're going to do a little well around it, make sure that that well isn't so big that all that dirt ends up on top of the tree afterwards. So you just want a shallow tree well around it to hold the water. And again, it's hard to see, but the root flare here, and you know, err on the side of caution. The bigger the mulch area, the better it is going to be for the tree because it's not competing with the turf grass. Because the turf grass is going to take all your water and nutrients first, and then what's left over will get to the tree roots. So, you know, we like to go where practical, right to the drip edge of the tree. But sometimes that's not practical. So this is, I like to show this picture. So trees are tough. And we throw them in holes too deep, they survive. And, you know, mulch them and they survive. But if you really give them what they need, which is basically drainage, oxygen, and good soil. So basically, the little crevice of this rock, this was growing under a big spruce tree, or this rock was under a big spruce tree that we limbed up, and that little seedling had enough soil in the crevice of that rock, and enough moisture, and enough drainage where it germinated and was growing. And I mean, and it turns into that. You know, I'm a wilderness hunter, which means I don't shoot many deer, I just walk around aimlessly. But I do shoot a lot of good photos. And that's up in the Adirondacks, and that's that same tree that grew in that little crack of the rock. And, you know, and they do survive, you know, no matter what we throw at them. And then the last slide, just a little tree humor. You should cedar ring magnolia got for her birthday. You never pine over me like that, and it's not okay. In fact, it makes me sycamore. And the guy says birch, birch, birch. So that's my little tree humor. But that's my little spiel. Anyone have any questions? Yeah.
I bought some fruit trees one time and I put them in, and then I realized that, you know, not the coal, but the flare was all covered up with the root, from dirt from the nursery. So I dug it down and saw little tiny rootlets were growing, you know, those aren't the real roots, they're not supposed to be covered up. And they said that the first root you come to that's the size of your finger, that sort of is where you're supposed to put the soil up. But I didn't know where to put it. I could see where they had the stain of the dirt, it was all mixed up.
Yeah,
And,
it seems to me that would be a little high. If you planted at the level where you saw the first root.
The size of your finger, they said.
Yeah,
So, but you're saying go down till you see the root flare and then that's it.
right,
The trunk always flares out with the roots.
Okay.
yeah. And some, you know, some tree varieties will be, the flare won't be as obvious as in others, like oaks, maples.
What about grass?
Someone said, what about grass?
Well, grass, they're gonna,
Oh,
you may not
grass.
see a flare on it.
Right, exactly. And, you know, all weeping trees are grafted. They're not a natural form that grows naturally. So they're grafting a weeping cherry on top of a standard cherry stock. But I think like elms or lindens really don't have a real exaggerated root flare. So there are some varieties where the flare is not going to be real exaggerated. Like this cucumber magnolia out here. And this oak, you can see how it flares out at the bottom. Any other questions? If you guys think of anything, obviously I'll be around for most of the morning and